Claire Morgan's seemingly perfect life shatters when she discovers her husband's betrayal. After uncovering his affair and financial deceit, she embarks on a battle for custody of their children and a fair share of their assets. As Tom fights back with everything he has, Claire must navigate a maze of legal battles, emotional turmoil, and her own self-doubt. With her children's future on the line, Claire faces a heartbreaking decision. How far will she go to secure their safety and her own freedom? The stakes are high, and the fight is far from over. Will Claire win, or will Tom destroy everything? The small town of Willow Creek was the kind of place where life felt simple and predictable. Everyone knew each other. The streets were lined with charming brick buildings, and there was always a friendly wave from a neighbor. At the heart of it all was Claire Morgan, a 39-year-old mother of two, with a life that seemed pulled straight from a magazine. She had it all, or so it seemed. Claire was the definition of balance. She managed the family's bustling schedule like a pro, cooked dinners that could rival those of any chef, and still found time to volunteer at the local community center. Her husband, Tom, was equally admired. A successful architect, Tom was the kind of man who never missed a soccer game for their son or a recital for their daughter. Together, they seemed like the couple everyone aspired to be. But, as is often the case, perfection is just a veneer. Claire's days were spent running from one task to the next, making sure everything in their world functioned like clockwork, from carpooling her kids, 13-year-old Ella and 10-year-old Jack, to ensuring the pantry was always stocked with their favorite snacks. She never stopped. And while Tom was always supportive, his work often took him away on trips to nearby cities for client meetings and site visits. Despite the occasional distance, Claire believed in their partnership. They had built their life together from scratch, starting with little more than the excitement of being young and in love. She trusted Tom implicitly. They had their routines, their jokes, and their shared dreams. Yet, there was an unsettling shift that Claire couldn't quite put her finger on. It started small. Tom's business trips became more frequent, and his explanations seemed hurried, like he was avoiding details. His once thoughtful goodnight texts when he was away grew shorter, often replaced with a single word. Busy. Claire, ever the optimist, brushed it off. She told herself he was under pressure at work. After all, life wasn't always sunshine and roses, and she knew that better than most. Then came the first crack. One Friday evening, while folding laundry in the bedroom, Claire's phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a text from her best friend, Olivia. The two had known each other since their college days and shared everything. Olivia's message was blunt. "Are you okay? I saw something weird today." Claire frowned and replied, "What do you mean?" After a long pause, Olivia sent a photo. It was a little blurry, taken from a distance, but there was no mistaking the man in it. Tom. He was sitting at an outdoor cafe in the city, leaning in close to a woman Claire didn't recognize. The two seemed deep in conversation, their body language far from casual. Claire's heart raced. Her first instinct was to defend him. Maybe it was a work meeting, she thought. Maybe Olivia had misunderstood. But as she stared at the photo, doubt began to creep in. Why hadn't Tom mentioned this meeting? Why did it feel off? When Tom came home later that night, Claire didn't bring it up right away. She wanted to watch him, see if he would offer an explanation on his own. He didn't. Instead, he kissed her on the cheek, claimed he was exhausted, and headed straight for the shower. The following week, Claire found herself noticing things she hadn't before. Tom's phone was always face down on the counter. He'd grown more protective of his laptop, closing it abruptly whenever she walked by. And then there were the whispers. Those brief phone calls he took in the garage, or while pretending to grab something from his car. Still, Claire hesitated to confront him. She feared what the truth might bring, and there was a part of her that clung to the idea that she might be overreacting. Instead, she confided in Olivia. What if I'm just being paranoid? She asked one evening as they sipped tea in Claire's kitchen. Olivia's face was serious. Claire, you're not paranoid. Trust your gut. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Claire nodded, but felt a pang of guilt. She hated the thought of doubting Tom. They had been through so much together. Could he really be hiding something? The answer came sooner than she expected. One rainy afternoon, while Tom was out of town again, Claire decided to clean the house from top to bottom. It was something she did to clear her mind. While tidying up Tom's home office, she noticed a manila folder peeking out from under a pile of papers on his desk. Curious, she picked it up and opened it. Inside were receipts for dinners and hotels in the city, places she didn't recognize. The dates matched nights he'd claimed to be working late. Her stomach dropped. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. She sat down on the edge of the chair, her hands trembling as she sifted through the evidence. Each receipt was another blow, another confirmation of her worst fears. Still, Claire wasn't ready to confront him. Not yet. She needed more than scraps of paper. She needed the whole picture. That evening, after tucking the kids into bed, Claire sat alone in the living room, staring at her phone. Finally, she did something she never thought she would. She downloaded a tracking app and linked it to Tom's phone. If he was hiding something, she was going to find out. The next few days were a blur. Claire went about her usual routine, smiling through school drop-offs and chatting with neighbors, all while secretly monitoring Tom's movements. When the app pinged one afternoon, showing him at a hotel downtown, her chest tightened. This was it. She told Olivia what she'd found, and her friend insisted on going with her. "You can't do this alone," Olivia said firmly. When they arrived at the hotel, Claire's hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the steering wheel. Olivia reached over and squeezed her arm. "You're stronger than this," she said. Taking a deep breath, Claire stepped out of the car and walked into the lobby. She didn't have a plan, just the overwhelming need to know the truth. As she approached the front desk, she glanced around nervously. A young clerk greeted her with a smile. "Can I help you?" Claire hesitated, then asked, "Is there a Tom Morgan staying here?" The clerk's smile faltered. "I'm sorry, Ma'am. We can't give out that information." But just as Claire turned to leave, the elevator doors opened across the lobby. And there he was, Tom. He didn't see her at first, too busy laughing with the woman next to him. The same woman from the photo Olivia had sent. Claire froze, her heart pounding in her ears. For a moment, it felt like the entire world had stopped. Then Tom looked up. Their eyes met, and the color drained from his face. It was the moment everything shattered. Claire's heart was racing as Tom froze in place, his face painted with guilt and panic. The woman at his side turned to look at her, confusion evident in her expression. For a split second, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, without a word, Claire turned on her heel and walked out of the hotel lobby, her mind a chaotic storm of anger, betrayal, and humiliation. Tom was right behind her, calling her name as he hurried to catch up. "Claire, wait," he said, grabbing her arm as she reached the parking lot. She spun around, eyes blazing. "Who is she, Tom?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a mixture of fury and heartbreak. "Don't lie to me." Tom hesitated, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The woman from the lobby had stepped outside, watching the confrontation unfold with a mixture of unease and curiosity. Claire glared at her. "You stay out of this." The woman raised her hands and quickly retreated back into the building. It was just Claire and Tom now, standing in the middle of the parking lot as the rain began to drizzle. Tom sighed heavily and ran a hand through his hair. "It's not what you think," he started, his voice low. Claire laughed bitterly. "Not what I think. Really, you're at a hotel with another woman, and it's not what I think. Enlighten me, Tom. Make it make sense." For a moment, Tom looked like he might try. He opened his mouth, but whatever excuse he was about to make never came. Instead, he muttered, "I didn't mean for you to find out like this." Claire felt like the ground had crumbled beneath her. "So it's true," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Her voice cracked as she added, "How long?" Tom looked away. 6 months. The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. 6 months. Half a year of lies, deceit, and pretending everything was fine. Claire's mind raced as she thought of all the nights he'd come home late. The business trips. The distant looks when he thought she wasn't watching. It had all been right in front of her, and she hadn't wanted to see it. Claire took a deep breath, her tears mixing with the rain now falling harder. "I trusted you," she said quietly. "We built a life together, Tom. A family. How could you throw that away?" Tom reached for her hand, but she stepped back. "I never wanted to hurt you, Claire," he said. I didn't know how to fix what was broken." "Broken?" Claire's voice rose. "You didn't try to fix anything. You didn't talk to me. You didn't work on us. You just ran to someone else. How does that fix anything?" Tom didn't have an answer. He stood there, defeated, while Claire stared at him, her chest heaving with the effort to hold back the sobs threatening to break free. Finally, she shook her head. "Go back to her, Tom. Go back to your little fantasy. Because this," she gestured between them, "is over." Without waiting for a response, Claire got into her car and drove away, leaving Tom standing in the rain. The days that followed were some of the hardest Claire had ever endured. She didn't know how to tell Ella and Jack that their father had betrayed her. How do you explain something like that to your kids without destroying their world? She avoided Tom's calls, ignored his texts, and leaned heavily on Olivia for support. Olivia was a rock, showing up with coffee and pastries every morning and helping Claire strategize her next steps. "You need to get a lawyer," Olivia said one evening as they sat on the couch. "You have to protect yourself and the kids." Claire nodded, but the thought of taking legal action made her stomach turn. She had spent her whole life trying to avoid conflict, but now it seemed unavoidable. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for her children. As much as she tried to keep things normal at home, Ella and Jack could sense something was wrong. Jack, ever the curious one, finally asked, "Mum, why hasn't Dad been home?" Claire froze, her hands tightening on the dish she was washing. "Your dad and we're going through something right now," she said carefully. "But no matter what, we both love you very much." Jack nodded solemnly, but Claire could see the questions swirling in his eyes. Ella, on the other hand, wasn't as willing to let it go. Later that night, she cornered Claire in the hallway. "Mom, what's really going on?" she demanded. "Did something happen with Dad?" Claire sighed and sat on the edge of Ella's bed, motioning for her to sit next to her. "Your dad made some bad choices," she said, her voice heavy with sadness. He broke my trust." Ella's face fell. "Is it another woman?" she asked bluntly. Claire looked at her daughter in shock. "How do you—" "I'm not a kid, Mom," Ella said, her voice trembling. "I've seen the way he's been acting. I knew something was wrong." Claire wrapped her arms around Ella as tears spilled down both their cheeks. "I'm so sorry you've had to go through this," she whispered. "But we're going to get through it together." A week later, Claire finally met with a lawyer. His name was David, and he came highly recommended by Olivia sitting in his office, surrounded by shelves of legal books. Claire felt like she was stepping into a battlefield. David was calm and professional, but he didn't sugarcoat anything. "You have options," he said. "But the most important thing is gathering evidence. If we can prove infidelity, the court will likely favor you in the divorce." Claire nodded, though the idea of digging deeper into Tom's betrayal made her feel sick. Still, she knew it had to be done. Over the next few weeks, Claire began piecing together the fragments of Tom's secret life. With Olivia's help, she accessed their joint bank account records and found several suspicious withdrawals, fancy dinners, hotel stays, and even gifts that had clearly not been for her. She also scoured his social media, finding subtle clues that pointed to his time with the other woman. As Claire uncovered more of the truth, her anger grew. She wasn't just heartbroken anymore. She was determined Tom had not only betrayed her, but he had also disrespected everything they had built together. She wasn't going to let him get away with it. At the same time, Claire focused on her kids, doing everything she could to shield them from the storm brewing behind the scenes. She took them on picnics, helped with school projects, and even let Ella dye a streak of her hair blue, much to Jack's amusement. Those little moments of joy became her anchor. One evening, as Claire was tucking Jack into bed, he looked up at her and said, "Mum, you're really strong." Claire smiled, her eyes welling up with tears. "Thank you, buddy. That means a lot." "You're like a superhero," he added. "But like, without the cape." Claire laughed softly and kissed his forehead. "I'll take it." The showdown with Tom was inevitable, and when it finally came, it was as explosive as Claire had expected. He showed up at the house one evening, demanding to see the kids. Claire met him at the door, her arms crossed. "You can see them, but we need to talk first." Tom sighed, clearly frustrated. "Claire, I know I messed up, but can we please just move on for the kids?" Claire stared at him in disbelief. "Move on, Tom. You cheated on me. You lied to me. And now you want to act like none of that matters?" "I'm trying to make things right," he said defensively. "No, you're trying to sweep it under the rug," Claire shot back. "But I'm not going to let you. You don't just get to walk away from this without consequences." Tom's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He knew he was in the wrong, and Claire wasn't backing down. As he left that night, Claire felt a sense of relief. She was done being a passive participant in her own life. She was taking control, one step at a time. Remember, if this story has you hooked, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world and helps us bring you more captivating stories like this one. The days passed in a blur for Claire, each one filled with more tension and uncertainty than the last. The pieces of Tom's betrayal were finally falling into place, but the weight of the truth was heavier than she ever could have imagined. Every day brought a new challenge, a new discovery, and a new test of Claire's strength. It wasn't just about the infidelity anymore. As Claire dug deeper, she uncovered a shocking trail of deceit that extended far beyond Tom's affair. He had been hiding money, not just for his personal escapades, but also for investments Claire had never heard of. These weren't just the actions of a man who had made a mistake. They were the moves of someone who had been planning a way out. But Claire wasn't the same woman she had been a few weeks ago. She was no longer paralyzed by the shock of Tom's betrayal. Instead, she was determined to fight back, not just for herself, but for her children, who deserved a life free from lies and manipulation. One evening, Olivia came over with a stack of papers she'd printed from Tom's online accounts. "You're not going to believe this," she said, dropping the documents onto Claire's kitchen table. "He's been moving money into offshore accounts." Claire stared at the papers in disbelief. Offshore accounts. "Why, what's he planning?" Olivia shrugged. "It's hard to say, but it's clear he's been preparing for this for a while. He probably thought you'd never find out." Claire felt her hands curl into fists. "He thinks he's so clever," she muttered, "but he doesn't realize I'm smarter than he gives me credit for." With Olivia's help, Claire began compiling all the evidence she had gathered so far. Bank statements, hotel receipts, social media screenshots. It was all there. A damning pile of proof that painted a clear picture of Tom's betrayal and deceit. Claire knew she needed to act quickly. If Tom was preparing to disappear, she had to stay one step ahead of him. The turning point came on a Saturday afternoon when Claire received a call from her lawyer, David. His tone was serious as he said, "Claire, I've just reviewed the documents you sent over. This is more than enough to build a solid case against Tom, but we need to move fast before he has a chance to hide anything else." Claire nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "What do we do next?" David explained the plan. They would file for divorce immediately, citing infidelity and financial misconduct. They would also request a court order to freeze Tom's accounts, ensuring he couldn't move any more money. It was a bold move, but Claire knew it was necessary. When she hung up the phone, Claire felt a surge of determination. She wasn't going to let Tom control the narrative any longer. This was her chance to take back her power. The confrontation came sooner than Claire expected. That evening, as she was helping Ella with her homework, the doorbell rang. When Claire opened the door, she found Tom standing on the porch, his face a mixture of anger and desperation. "We need to talk," he said. Pushing past her into the house, Claire crossed her arms and followed him into the living room. "What do you want, Tom?" "I know what you're doing," he said, turning to face her. "You've been digging through my accounts, haven't you?" Claire didn't flinch. "You mean the accounts you've been hiding from me? The ones you've been using to funnel money into your little secret life?" Tom's jaw tightened. "You don't understand." "No, Tom," Claire interrupted. "You don't understand. You lied to me. You betrayed me. And now you're trying to cover your tracks. But it's too late. I have everything I need to prove what you've done." Tom took a step closer, his voice low and dangerous. "You're making a mistake, Claire. If you push this, it's going to get ugly." Claire stood her ground. "It's already ugly, Tom, and I'm not afraid of you." Tom stared at her for a moment, then turned and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. Claire felt her knees weaken, but she didn't let herself crumble. She had come too far to back down now. The next morning, Claire met with David to finalize the divorce papers. Sitting in his office, she felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. This was it, the moment she took control of her future. David slid the papers across the desk. "All you have to do is sign," he said. Claire picked up the pen and hesitated for only a moment before signing her name. As the ink dried on the page, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. It wasn't over yet, but it was a start. Meanwhile, Tom was scrambling to regain control. He hadn't expected Claire to fight back so fiercely, and it was throwing his plans into chaos. He tried to reach out to her, leaving voicemails and sending texts that ranged from apologetic to accusatory, but Claire didn't respond. She knew better than to let him manipulate her again. As the tension between them escalated, Claire focused on her children. She wanted to protect them from the fallout as much as possible, but it wasn't easy. Ella and Jack were smart, and they could sense that something big was happening. Claire sat them down one evening and did her best to explain the situation in a way they could understand. "Your dad and I are going through a really tough time," she said. "But I want you to know that we both love you very much, and we're going to do everything we can to make sure you're okay." Ella nodded, her expression serious. "We'll be okay, Mum. We're strong, just like you." Claire smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "Thank you, sweetie. That means a lot." The breaking point came a week later, when Claire received a call from Olivia. "You're not going to believe this," Olivia said, her voice trembling with excitement. "I found something huge." "What is it?" Claire asked, her heart pounding. "There's a property in Tom's name," Olivia said. "It's out of town, and it's listed under a shell company. I think it might be where he's been meeting her." Claire's mind raced. This was the final piece of the puzzle, the proof she needed to expose Tom's lies once and for all. She called David immediately and explained what Olivia had found. David wasted no time. "We'll subpoena the records," he said. "If this property is connected to his affair, It will be a game changer in court. As the court date approached, the tension between Claire and Tom reached a boiling point. Tom tried to intimidate her, showing up unannounced and demanding to see the kids. But Claire stood her ground, refusing to let him bully her. On the day of the hearing, Claire walked into the courtroom with her head held high. She had Olivia by her side for support, and David was ready to present their case. Tom was there too, his lawyer at his side. But he looked less confident than Claire had ever seen him. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and he knew it. David laid out the case with precision, presenting the receipts, bank statements, and property records that painted a clear picture of Tom's betrayal and deceit. Claire watched as Tom squirmed in his seat, unable to meet her gaze. When it was her turn to speak, Claire stood and faced the judge. She spoke from the heart, describing the pain Tom's actions had caused and her determination to protect her children. Her voice was steady, but there was no mistaking the emotion behind her words. When the judge finally delivered the verdict, it was a victory for Claire. She was awarded full custody of the children, and the court ordered Tom to pay significant child support. The property Tom had tried to hide was sold, with the proceeds going to Claire and the kids. Claire walked out of the courtroom that day feeling a sense of triumph she hadn't felt in years. She had fought for her family and won. But more than that, she had proven to herself that she was stronger than she had ever realized. As Claire walked out of the courtroom, her mind was still racing, and her body felt as though it had just been through a storm. It had been a battle. No, it had been a war. But in the end, she had come out victorious. Full custody of Ella and Jack. A sizable settlement that would protect their future. And Tom, well, Tom was about to face the consequences of his actions. Yet even as she breathed a sigh of relief, a knot formed in her stomach. This wasn't just about the court ruling. This wasn't just about winning a legal battle. There were still pieces of her heart that felt shattered. A part of her, no matter how strong or how determined, was still mourning the life she thought she had with Tom. The ride home from the courthouse was quiet. Ella and Jack sat in the back seat, their faces unreadable. Claire knew they were processing everything, just as she was. The whole ordeal had been hard on them. But now, at least, there was a clear path ahead. They could start rebuilding, and that thought alone filled Claire with determination. The worst was behind them. But of course, Tom wasn't going to go down without a fight. Claire had expected that, and she'd been right. The day after the hearing, Claire's phone rang. The number on the screen wasn't one she recognized, but the voice on the other end was unmistakable. "It's me." Tom's voice crackled. He sounded different, haggard, desperate. "I know you're angry, Claire, but we need to talk. This doesn't have to end like this." Claire's stomach twisted, but she kept her tone calm. "It already has ended, Tom. You had your chance to fix things, and you chose not to. Now it's my turn." "I'm not talking about us, Claire," he said, his voice low and almost pleading. "I'm talking about the kids. If you really want to make this work, we can do this the right way. Don't make me fight you in court again. I'll fight dirty if I have to." For a moment, Claire said nothing. She gripped the phone tightly in her hand, anger bubbling up again. He was still trying to control the narrative, still trying to manipulate her into thinking he had the power to dictate their lives. But Claire was done. She exhaled sharply. "You don't get to dictate anything anymore. I'm not afraid of you, Tom. I'm not scared of the fight you think you can drag me into. And you're not going to turn this into some game of who can hurt who more. You don't get to hurt me anymore. Not now, not ever." There was a long silence on the other end. Then, Tom's voice came back, softer. "I just want a chance to make things right with the kids." Claire closed her eyes for a second. She could feel the weight of everything, the betrayal, the lies, the anger, all of it pressing on her chest. But she was stronger now. You can't make things right, Tom. Not with me, not with the kids. You broke their trust, and you'll have to rebuild it on your own. Another long silence followed. Finally, Tom muttered, I guess I'll see you in court. Claire didn't respond. She ended the call and sat there for a moment, letting the weight of it all settle in. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. She was done being afraid. The next few weeks were a blur of legal paperwork, tense negotiations, and quiet moments at home with Ella and Jack. Claire had expected Tom to fight her every step of the way. But as the days passed, something strange began to happen. His efforts to control the situation started to unravel. He was losing ground fast, and it was clear to Claire that he wasn't prepared for what was coming. One evening, Claire sat down with her lawyer, David, to go over the latest developments. Tom's lawyer is going to try to drag this out, David said, frowning as he flipped through the documents. They'll use every trick in the book, but we're in a strong position. We've got the evidence, we've got the support, and we've got the law on our side. Claire nodded, but there was a nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach. She'd already been through so much, she didn't know how much more she could handle. David, do you think he'll actually fight for the kids? She asked, her voice quieter than she intended. David looked up, his expression softening. It's hard to say, but I can tell you one thing. If he really cared, he wouldn't have done what he did. This isn't just about the affair, Claire. This is about the choices he's made, and the consequences of those choices. He's burned a lot of bridges. That was the truth. Tom had burned so many bridges, and Claire was one of the last things he had left to hold on to. But she wasn't going to let him use their children as pawns in a game that he had started. The next bombshell hit when Claire received a letter from Tom's lawyer demanding a meeting. She knew immediately that this was a last-ditch effort to avoid the inevitable. Tom was trying to save face, trying to hold on to whatever little dignity he had left. Claire sat in the lawyer's office a few days later, trying to remain calm as Tom's attorney laid out his proposal. They were offering a financial settlement, one that would let Tom keep his business and avoid any further public scandal. In exchange, Claire was supposed to agree to joint custody. It was everything Claire had expected, a manipulation, a ploy to save his reputation while leaving her with the emotional burden of caring for their children. She barely held back her laughter. You think I'm going to let him get away with this after everything? After everything he's done? She shook her head. I won't play this game, and I won't let my kids be caught in the middle. David didn't even hesitate. We're rejecting the offer, he said, his voice firm. It's a slap in the face, and we're not going to take it. Let's take this to court. Let's finish this once and for all. The moment the words left his mouth, Claire felt a surge of strength wash over her. She had made it through the worst. Now, it was time to finish what she had started. The final confrontation came in the courtroom. The stakes had never been higher. Tom sat across from Claire, his face tight with frustration, his lawyer speaking for him at every turn. But Claire didn't need to say a word. Her evidence, her strength, and the truth were enough. The judge listened carefully, weighing both sides, but Claire could tell from his expression that he wasn't impressed by Tom's desperate attempts to save face. As the final arguments were made, Claire's heart pounded in her chest. She knew this was the moment she had put everything on the line. She had fought for her kids, for herself, and for the future they deserved. When the judge finally spoke, his words were clear and decisive. Claire was awarded full custody of Ella and Jack, and Tom was ordered to pay child support. The judge also issued a restraining order to ensure that Tom could not interfere in their lives any further. It was a clear victory, a victory that would change the course of Claire's life forever. As the gavel fell, Claire's heart swelled with relief. She had won. She had fought for her family, and now they were free. Walking out of the courtroom, Claire's legs felt shaky, but her spirit was stronger than it had ever been. Tom was no longer a threat. She was free to rebuild her life, to focus on her children, and to find peace again. Ella and Jack ran toward her, their faces lit up with smiles. "We did it, Mom," Jack exclaimed. Claire pulled them both into a tight hug, feeling the weight of the past few months finally lift. "Yes, we did," she whispered. "We did it together." It was the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with hope, strength, and the promise of a future they could create, free from the chains of betrayal and lies. As Claire left the courtroom, she felt like she was walking through a haze. The verdict was in, and in so many ways, it was a victory. Full custody, financial security. A chance to start fresh. But the process had taken its toll. The past few months had been a whirlwind of legal battles, emotional turmoil, and moments of doubt. And now, finally, she was free. But even as she stepped into her car, Ella and Jack sitting quietly in the back seat, there was a lingering sense of unease. Yes, Tom was out of her life for good, but that didn't mean the emotional scars from his betrayal would heal instantly. As she drove home, she glanced at the rearview mirror, her eyes meeting Ella's in the reflection. Her daughter's expression was calm, but Claire could see the questions in her eyes. The kids had been through so much, too much for their young ages, and though they had won in court, Claire knew the real work was only beginning. They had to rebuild, not just their lives, but their trust in the world around them. "Mom." Ella's voice broke through her thoughts. "Are we going to be okay?" Claire smiled, trying to mask the uncertainty she was feeling. "Yes, sweetie, we're going to be okay. We're going to be better than okay." Ella nodded slowly, but Claire could tell her mind was still racing. She couldn't blame her. There was no quick fix for the damage that had been done. And there was a part of Claire, just a small part, that still wondered if Tom would ever truly face the consequences of his actions. Later that evening, as Claire sat down at the kitchen table to talk with Olivia, she reflected on the whirlwind that had brought her to this point. Olivia had been her rock through everything, her lawyer, her confidant, her friend. If it weren't for Olivia's unwavering support, Claire wasn't sure she would have had the strength to stand up to Tom when it mattered most. "I can't believe it's over," Claire said, leaning back in her chair. "Part of me still feels like it's all a dream." Olivia smiled warmly. "I know what you mean. But it's not a dream, Claire. It's real. You did it." The praise made Claire's chest swell with pride, but deep down, she knew that this wasn't just about her. It was about her children. She had fought for their future, for the peace they all deserved. And now, it was time to heal. "I feel like I've been holding my breath for months," Claire continued, her voice shaking slightly. "I'm just so tired of fighting, tired of living in the shadow of his lies." Olivia reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "I know, but you did it. You stood up for yourself, for your kids. That's something Tom could never do." Claire nodded, but her mind was still racing. As much as she wanted to look ahead and embrace the new chapter, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was still one last piece of the puzzle left to solve. Tom. His final words in the courtroom haunted her. "I'll make sure you regret this." She had no idea what he meant by that, but something told her he wasn't finished. A few days later, the final blow came. Claire was sitting in her living room with the kids when the phone rang. She didn't recognize the number, but answered it anyway. It was a call from her attorney, David. "Claire, I need you to sit down." David's voice was tense. Tom's lawyer filed an appeal. "He's challenging the custody ruling." Claire's heart sank. She had expected Tom to put up a fight. But this felt like the last desperate attempt to retain control over her and the kids. "What does this mean?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. David's voice softened. "It means we'll have to go through another round in court. It'll delay the finalization, but you're still in a strong position. The judge was clear in his ruling. You have everything you need to fight back. Claire gripped the phone tighter, trying to steady her breathing. This was it, the final hurdle. Tom wasn't going to let her go without a fight, but this time Claire wasn't going to back down. She had everything she needed, and she was ready to finish this once and for all. I'm not backing down, Claire said, her voice firm. I'm not letting him do this to me. To us, I'll fight him until the end. David paused before responding. That's what I like to hear, Claire. Let's get this over with. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork, legal meetings, and long nights spent preparing for the final hearing. Tom's appeals were nothing more than a series of last-ditch efforts to drag the case out, but Claire was determined to end it. She knew that every delay brought more uncertainty, more opportunities for Tom to try to reclaim control. Through it all, Ella and Jack continued to adjust to their new reality. At times, the emotional toll on them was evident. Ella, normally outgoing and full of energy, had become withdrawn. Jack, ever the playful one, had become quiet and distant. Claire tried to make their home as normal as possible, but she knew the strain of the past months was weighing on them. One evening, as Claire was reading to Jack before bed, he looked up at her with wide eyes. Mom, do you think Dad will ever come back? Claire's heart twisted at the question. She had been bracing herself for this moment, but hearing the words spoken aloud made it real. Nobody, she said softly. Your dad has made some choices that hurt our family. But I promise you, we'll be okay. We have each other. Jack nodded, but Claire could see the sadness in his eyes. She kissed his forehead and tucked him in, her own heart breaking as she thought about the life they could have had, the life that Tom had taken away. The final day of the appeal hearing arrived, and Claire felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff. It had been months since the initial trial, and now, everything was about to be decided. She arrived at the courthouse early, her stomach a bundle of nerves. She'd been through so much already, but this last step felt like the most critical one. Tom was there too, his expression grim. His lawyer was already speaking with the judge, attempting to present his case. But Claire had something Tom didn't. Truth and truth, no matter how hard it was to face, always found a way to rise to the surface. As Claire sat down in the courtroom, she glanced at David, who gave her a reassuring nod. You're ready for this, he said quietly. We've got this. The hearing began, and the tension in the room was palpable. Tom's lawyer tried to argue that the original ruling was flawed, that Claire wasn't fit for full custody, that the kids needed both parents. But Claire knew better than to let his words shake her. She had prepared for this moment, and she wasn't going to let Tom's lies tear apart the family she was working so hard to rebuild. When it was Claire's turn to speak, she stood tall, her voice unwavering. I've done everything in my power to be a good mother to my children, she said, her eyes steady on Tom as she spoke. I've put their needs above my own, and I will continue to do so. I've fought for them. For their future, Tom may be their father, but he hasn't been there for them the way I have. And that's why I'm asking the court to finalize the custody arrangement as it is. The judge listened intently, then turned to Tom's lawyer, who had no rebuttal. It was clear the judge was already leaning in Claire's favor, and as the session continued, Tom's chances dwindled. When the final verdict came, it was a clear win for Claire. The custody agreement stood, and Tom's appeal was dismissed. It was over. Claire had fought and won, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe. As she walked out of the courthouse, Ella and Jack by her side, Claire couldn't help but feel a rush of pride they had survived. They had faced down the worst and come out stronger for it. Tom had been her past, but he was no longer her present, or her future. She was ready to move forward, ready to build the life she and her children deserved. Claire had fought hard for this moment, for this victory, but as she walked out of the courtroom, she didn't feel the sense of triumph she had imagined. Instead, a strange quiet settled over her. The tension of the past months had been relentless, and though the weight of the court's final ruling was now lifted from her shoulders, the future ahead still felt uncertain. She could hear the sound of Ella and Jack's footsteps behind her as they walked out together, the soft shuffle of their shoes against the courthouse floor. Their faces were tired but hopeful, and for the first time in a long time, Claire allowed herself to hope too. "Mum?" Ella's voice broke the silence. Claire turned to find her daughter looking at her with a mix of admiration and concern. "Is everything going to be okay now?" Claire smiled and reached for Ella's hand, squeezing it gently. "Yes, sweetheart. Everything is going to be okay. We're going to be okay." Jack, always the optimist, skipped ahead of them, his excitement evident. We won, Mum." His grin was infectious, and Claire felt a flicker of warmth in her chest. Yet, despite the victory, a lingering sense of unease still tugged at her heart. She could feel Tom's presence looming in the background, even though she hadn't seen him since the final hearing. He had promised her a fight, and somehow, despite everything, Claire had a gut feeling that this wasn't the last chapter. It was more like the eye of the storm, a brief moment of calm before it started again. That night, Claire couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts racing. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards as Ella and Jack drifted off to sleep. They had both seemed relieved, but Claire knew it wasn't that simple. The emotional toll on them was far from over. She had seen it in their eyes, the lingering uncertainty. They were resilient, yes, but they had been through more than any children should ever have to endure. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, and she jumped, startled. When she picked it up, she saw a new message from Olivia. "We need to talk, call me when you can." Claire felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She had a bad feeling about this, a sense that Olivia was about to deliver some news that would throw everything back into chaos. But there was no turning back now. She dialed Olivia's number, her fingers trembling slightly. When Olivia answered, her voice was tight, unusually serious. "Claire, there's something you need to know," Olivia said, her words slow and deliberate. "Tom isn't giving up." Claire's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Olivia took a deep breath. "He's hired a private investigator. He's trying to gather dirt on you. He's not just going to walk away, Claire. He's plotting something." Claire closed her eyes, her hand gripping the phone so tightly it almost hurt. This was exactly what she had feared. Tom hadn't accepted defeat. Not yet. "Do you know what he's planning?" Claire asked, her voice steady despite the rush of anger and fear building within her. "I don't know the details," Olivia replied, "but I think it's a last-ditch attempt to discredit you. He's going to try to turn the kids against you, or worse, try to say you're unfit. We need to be prepared for anything." Claire's stomach twisted. "I'm not going to let him destroy everything again, I won't." Olivia's voice softened. "I know. But you need to stay ahead of this. Keep everything above board. If he's going to make his move, we have to be ready." The weight of it all hit Claire like a physical blow. She thought it was over. She had been so sure. But now, she had to face the terrifying reality that Tom's fight wasn't over. He wasn't just trying to take her down. He was trying to take everything from her. From her kids, from her life, from her future. Over the next few days, Claire could feel the tension building. She had always known Tom had a dark side, but she had underestimated how far he would go to maintain control. The constant calls, the texts. She could almost feel his presence lingering around every corner, even when he wasn't physically there. She wasn't going to let him win. She wouldn't allow it. But there was no denying the toll it was taking on her. She found herself snapping at the kids more than usual. Her patience worn thin by the looming threat of Tom's retaliation, Ella had started pulling away, retreating into her room more and more, while Jack became unusually quiet. Claire knew they were both carrying the emotional weight of everything that had happened, but the added stress was beginning to take its toll. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner, Ella approached Claire in the living room. She looked hesitant, unsure of how to broach the subject. "Mum, are you okay?" Ella asked, her voice soft and sincere. Claire turned to face her daughter, surprised by the question. "I'm fine, sweetie," she said, trying to mask the exhaustion in her voice. "Why wouldn't I be?" Ella sat down next to her brow furrowed. "You've been acting different. You're always so calm, but lately, it's like you're carrying the weight of the world." Claire felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't realized how much her anxiety was affecting Ella. Her daughter had always been the perceptive one, and now it seemed she was noticing things Claire hadn't been able to hide. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," Claire said, her voice breaking. "I don't mean to be like this, it's just... everything that's happened, I'm just trying to protect us, to keep you safe." Ella nodded, but her expression softened. "I know, Mum. We're in this together, right? No matter what happens." Claire smiled through the tears that had started to form. "Yes, baby. We're in this together." The next week, Claire received another unsettling call from Olivia. "We've got a problem," Olivia said, her voice tense. "Tom's private investigator has started digging into your background, looking into things you haven't even thought about. We need to make sure there's nothing in your past he can use against you." Claire felt a chill run down her spine. The idea that Tom had hired someone to dig into her life, her past, felt like an invasion of privacy. She was done with the secrets, done with hiding. But this was different. This was an all-out attack on her character, on everything she had worked so hard to build. "What should I do?" Claire asked, her voice low. Olivia's tone was firm. "Start preparing yourself. You need to make sure your finances are in order, and we need to get ahead of whatever he's planning. He's not going to just go away. If we don't act fast, we'll be playing catch-up." Claire didn't sleep that night. She spent hours going through old records, receipts, and legal documents, making sure everything was in place. It was exhausting work, but she couldn't afford to leave anything to chance. In the morning, as she sat at the kitchen table with her coffee, the phone rang again. It was David. "I've got some good news," David said, his voice much more upbeat than Claire had expected. "We've got the upper hand. We've got enough evidence to completely dismantle Tom's case, Claire. He's running out of options." For the first time in days, Claire let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The end was finally in sight, but she knew better than to relax. The battle wasn't over yet, and Tom was going to fight to the bitter end. But Claire was prepared. She was ready. She had already lost too much to let him take anything more. The final showdown with Tom had come and gone, and though Claire felt like she had won the battle, the emotional aftermath was still settling in. As the weeks passed, she watched her children begin to adjust to their new life, one free from the shadows of Tom's betrayal. The tension that had gripped their home for so long was beginning to fade, replaced by a tentative peace. Ella had slowly started to open up again. She was no longer hiding behind her walls, her laughter returning in the form of silly jokes and impromptu dance parties in the living room. Jack, too, was slowly finding his old self again, his playful nature emerging more with each passing day. For the first time in months, Claire felt a sense of hope for the future, something she had lost somewhere along the way during the chaos of the divorce. But even as they healed, there was still the question of Tom. His defeat in court had been a public one, and for all the money and connections he hadn't been able to escape the consequences of his actions. Yet Claire knew, from the way he had looked at her during the hearings, that he wasn't done with her. He had made it clear. He would make her regret this. As the weeks passed after the final ruling, however, the silence from Tom had been deafening. No phone calls, no desperate pleas for reconciliation. Nothing. It seemed that, for once, he had been backed into a corner. And perhaps for the first time, Claire realized that he was just as human as she was. One afternoon, Claire was sitting on the back porch, a cup of coffee in her hands, watching the kids play in the yard. The house had been quiet for so long now, and it felt surreal. There was no more tension, no more secrets hanging over them. It felt like the calm after the storm. Just as she was lost in the simple joy of watching her children, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Olivia. "Tom's out. He's left town." At first, Claire didn't understand what that meant. Olivia had been keeping track of Tom's situation, post-divorce, his business deals, his movements, and it was through Olivia that Claire had learned Tom was struggling. His business was hemorrhaging, his relationships fraying. Out of town didn't just mean he was leaving for a few days, it meant he was leaving for good. The last shred of his old life, the one he had tried to keep intact, had fallen apart. Claire felt a mixture of relief and sadness. It was a strange feeling, the finality of it. Tom had been a major part of her life for so long, and even though he had hurt her in ways she couldn't begin to describe, she realized there was still a part of her that mourned what could have been. The family they had once dreamed of had been shattered, and now there was nothing left to rebuild. But as much as it hurt, she knew it was the right decision. They needed closure. They needed a future without his presence looming over them. A few weeks later, Claire was in the living room, organizing some paperwork, when she heard a knock on the door. It was late, and the sound startled her. She opened it cautiously and found Olivia standing there, holding a bottle of wine and a bag of takeout. "I thought you could use a little treat after all this," Olivia said with a wink, stepping inside. Claire smiled and hugged her friend tightly. "You have no idea how much I've needed this, thanks, Liv." The two sat on the couch, catching up, laughing, and reminiscing about the good times they'd shared. They talked about the kids, their plans for the future, and all the things that had happened in the past year. Claire found herself sharing things she hadn't realized she'd been holding inside. The anger, the fear, the uncertainty. But as she talked, she could feel the weight lifting, piece by piece. "You know," Olivia said thoughtfully, her tone changing, "you've been through hell, but you're stronger than you think. You've done more than just survive. You've created a new life for yourself, for the kids, for all of you." Claire nodded, her gaze fixed on the glass of wine in her hand. "I think I'm finally starting to see that," she said softly. "I spent so long focused on surviving, on getting through each day, that I forgot to look up and see where I was headed. I forgot to think about what I wanted." "Well, now's your chance," Olivia said with a smile. "You've got a clean slate. You can do whatever you want." Claire smiled back, feeling a sense of possibility she hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe it's time I start living for me for once, just for me. As the evening wore on, Claire realized how far she had come. She had started this journey afraid and uncertain, but she had come out the other side stronger, more resilient, and more aware of her worth than ever before. She was a mother, a survivor, and now, more than anything, she was ready to live for herself, to build the life she had always dreamed of, not just for her kids, but for her. Months later, things had settled into a rhythm. Ella and Jack were thriving, the echoes of the past growing quieter with each passing day. Claire had decided to take a bold step forward. She had enrolled in a course she had always wanted to take, but had put off for years. It was something just for her, something that would give her the chance to rediscover her own passions, separate from the roles she had been forced into. She had also started looking into opening her own business, something small at first, but big in its potential. She knew she had it in her. And with Olivia's support, Claire was certain she could make it happen. For the first time in a long time, Claire felt excited about the future. As she watched the kids playing in the yard, Claire smiled to herself. She had built a new life. Not just a life that was free from Tom's betrayal, but a life that was her own. One where she was in control. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about thriving, about living with purpose and strength, and giving her children the life they deserved. As the sun set on that peaceful evening, Claire sat on the porch, a quiet sense of peace settling over her. She had faced the worst and come out stronger. She had faced the unknown and found a way forward. And now, with her children by her side and a future full of endless possibilities ahead, she could finally say she was at peace. If you've enjoyed this story and want to hear more, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel for future videos. Your support means so much, and it helps us bring you even more stories of strength, resilience, and the journeys that shape us. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.